In this episode, we talk about diversifying our language curriculum so that it's more representative of the full breadth of voices and lived experience of our target language cultures. I'm joined by Benjamin Tinsley, a French teacher in Philadelphia, who shares what he's doing in his classroom, along with advice for centering traditionally underrepresented voices in our classrooms. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively? If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and I have to always start by saying thank you so much for being here on behalf of your colleagues and your students. You're taking the time to think about your teaching every week when you listen to these podcasts. So thank you so much for being that awesome teacher that you are. While I have your quick attention with the accolades, just take a second, look down at that app that you're using, make sure that you are pressing whatever it's asking you to do. Some are saying subscribe, some are saying follow, but whatever that is, just make sure that you are pressing that button so that you get these podcast episodes every week when they come out, and you can hear from awesome people like Benjamin Tinsley, who we'll be talking to today. So we're really going to be looking at our world language classrooms and the curriculum and what they represent, what we show to students. And we're going to specifically be speaking with Benjamin Tinsley today, who's a French teacher. So his work has been about the Francophone cultures and what's been sort of lacking or missing in French classrooms for many years, and what he's noticed about that and what's he's bringing into it. But if you're not a French teacher, definitely stick around, because these are topics and ideas and suggestions that you can easily use in any classroom. Benjamin is a French teacher. He is in Philadelphia at Germantown Academy, and he's been teaching for about 13 years, and he's had that experience in the public sector as well, being in charter schools and now at Germantown Academy as well. And I enjoy his blog so much and his YouTube videos, and I was so drawn to what he's doing from that. So that's enough from hearing about me. So let's dive into this conversation with Benjamin. So hello, Benjamin. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for having me, Joshua.
I'm trying to be ultra polite in calling you Benjamin, but I also see that you're Ben all over the place as well. So what do you prefer?
Yeah, I'm Ben, Benzo, Tins, whatever comes to mind.
Oh,
Just keep calling
can
me.
I totally call you Benzo?
Please, I would love that.
Right. So I gave a little kind of teaser about who you are and what you do,
Yeah.
but is there anything else that we should know about you that'll help us with this discussion?
Yeah, so I've been, like you said, this is my 13th year in the classroom. But one of the things, and I'm sure we'll get to this, but
Mm-hmm.
I've been a student for my whole life, and I feel like
Mm-hmm.
that's been such a critical part of who I am as a teacher, is just sort of that I'm always learning, I'm always pushing to continue growing in that sort of way. Um, and that informs so much of what I do
Mm-hmm.
as a teacher in front of students.
I see what you put out on social media and what's on your website, that it's always that learning process. I think
Yeah,
that's when you look at the bio on your website, it's the first thing you say, right? What is
yeah,
it? It says, I have been, you say, I have been a Black teacher for 13 years, but a Black student for, I don't know how old you are,
37. Yeah, 37
37 years. Yeah.
as of last Saturday. Yeah,
Okay, all right,
37.
yeah. So you put it right out there.
Yeah,
You've been a teacher for this long, but you started as a student and you continue to. And I
yeah,
love
absolutely.
that humble approach of teachers. So thank you
Yeah,
for taking that approach.
yeah,
So
thank you.
can you tell us about your personal experience with language learning? What did that look
Yeah,
like for you?
yeah. So I grew up in a monolingual household. My family
Mm-hmm.
is of Jamaican descent, and we were very much in my hometown, small town on Long Island, New York. very much a minority. Until when I was in about seventh grade, a Haitian family, the Titus, shout out to the Titus family, moved
Mm-hmm.
next door to us. And there was just such a deep connection from the gate, being families of Caribbean descent.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just go over their house and listen to them speak in Haitian Creole and in French. And the from day one, I was like hooked. Like I need to do this. I need to be able to do this. And I was so warmly received in their house, and the food and the music and so many things about that experience just like ignited something within me. So then in eighth grade, I started studying French in school. Eighth and ninth grade, I did it in school. And then 10th grade, I actually was an exchange student with the Rotary International Youth Exchange. So I was in France for in 2000, 2001, not far from Amiens in the north of France. So a lot of my experience there, and a lot of what again informs my approach as a teacher, is seeing that connection, but also that disconnect of what was my actual experience and how I grew in proficiency and how I grew in the visibility of people. I didn't see black and brown people when I studied it in school.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't until I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in French, and I dual majored in African American studies. And so it wasn't until then that I really started to see a convergence of that, to see
Mm-hmm.
black and brown faces. And that wasn't even until I got into upper level classes. So seeing that absence there, that like my experience was the warm reception of the Haitian family that brought me in and taught me so much. But then when I got to school, that it was almost the opposite of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that shaped so much of what I do and why I do what I do.
So, how old were you when you started studying French?
Eighth grade, I'm 13 at that point. Yeah.
So, was that something that you were aware of, a cognizant of in your eighth, ninth, 10th grade classes when you'd look at it and you'd say, these experiences and these cultural aspects that we're talking about, I'm not seeing, my direct experience of
Yeah.
this Haitian family and nobody looks like me.
Well, I think that was a general lens that I had to have as a kid. I mean, my mom was a teacher, she's a retired
Mm-hmm.
teacher. And every subject, we always had to look at it and say, these are the books that were offered. This is what the teachers are saying. This is how you can play that game. But we also have to look at who's missing. How are they painting our experiences? So I think that from an early age, from me, there was always that critical lens of how much trust almost we can put in the academy itself and in education itself, and how we were sort of portrayed within it or how we were erased within it. And so that extended to the language classroom for sure for me.
The words that you use, that trust and erased,
Mm,
and we assume that's not happening, when you have white students in a classroom learning about a culture where they're only seeing, oh, these are French people in
totally.
Paris, specifically speaking about
Yeah.
French, and then, I mean, somewhat textbooks in the late 90s started changing the names that they were
Yeah.
using in the
I mean, not that.
textbooks. It felt very token
Exactly.
like to me, having taught since 97.
Yeah.
I've seen that. So it felt like there was somewhat of an attempt
Yeah.
to do that, but it still felt erased and still that lack of trust. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. I mean, it speaks so much to me about sort of my current experiences. And I think a lot of what I see in classrooms about what DEI, and I put in
Mm-hmm.
quotes here, DEI, who's it
Mm-hmm.
really serving? And what does inclusion and diversity really look like? Is it serving the 10-year-old, the 13-year-old version of Ben Tinsley in that class? Or is
Mm-hmm.
it serving, the white liberal teachers to sort of check that box? And so, again, one of the things that I think about in terms of why I've started to create materials and started to create curriculum is looking back at that like Toni Morrison quote. It's like, if you don't find the book that you want to read, then you have to write it. And I spent so much time looking for the book that didn't just tokenize, looking for the book that showed the full range of humanity of Black and Brown people, whether it be Black and Brown people in the Francophone world or in the Spanish speaking world or here at home, in ways that didn't necessarily frame us in terms of subjects of oppression, though that also would be part of it, but really showing that we can be people who sometimes are nervous about the test coming up on Friday too, and who like food and music and are musicians and not just athletes, and not just rappers and those sorts of things. So
I appreciate that lens on the DEI, who's it really for?
yeah.
And so just I'm gonna be like tweeting out quotes of this all over the place, just so be on the lookout. I'm very interested to hear how you have taken that idea of it's not there, so you need to do it yourself, because that's essentially what you are doing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And also along with that DEI concept of who is this really for,
Mm.
when we are like looking at those textbooks in the early 90s that were making their attempts to put the African names
Yeah.
in the dialogues,
Sure.
even though they weren't changing anything culturally, they were still living in Paris,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so in there was the effort of that to make the white kids reading it say, oh, there are other people
Yeah.
besides these white French people that speak it? Or was it so that Black students looking at it were saying, I'm reflected in
Yeah.
there? Right. So what do you see with that?
Well, that brings me to the concept of windows and mirrors, right? And that there's value in
Mm-hmm.
that too. I struggle still with, like I said, I spent the first half of my career really teaching in Philadelphia in charter schools, and since I've been in independent schools. So I struggle a lot with feeling like I've abandoned kids who are historically marginalized and under resourced and all that. I also see the value of being in these schools where these kids are ultimately going to be in positions of power, right? And so knowing what we
Mm-hmm.
know about the ways in which doctors listen to or don't listen to Black women, the ways in which med students actually believe that Black people have thicker skin and higher tolerance for pain. Being able to present that Black lives matter, that Black people are people, to that audience feels, and I might just be trying to sleep better at night, but it feels like it's equally valuable, to be in those spaces where those kids who even just the presence of their Black male teacher shifts their worldview a bit. The presence of their Black male teacher who they have to, and it's not to say that they're outwardly resistant to that, but that they have to sort of see me as not an authority figure, but as someone worthy of their respect just as much as their white teacher who's an alum of that school, their white teacher who went to a college that may have a little bit bougier of a reputation than the colleges that I went to. So those things, I feel like it's not to say it's not serving those students, but it's using this experience and taking advantage of this opportunity to then spread and have a ripple effect in the world beyond my classroom.
A lot of times with these discussions, I think teachers are making an honest effort to make their classrooms more inclusive and multicultural is the word I'll use
Yeah.
there, a little bit of a buzzword. But they tend to be that one-off, like, oh, so yes, oh, and they also, oh, and I can say personally for me, moment of true honesty is if I'm looking at a room and I say something that's very specific to maybe holidays or something, and I mention example about maybe a
Sure.
Sunday or going to church or something like that, and I lock eyes with a Jewish student in my class, I will say, or synagogue. When you lock eyes with someone who needs it, you say it. And the real our real
Amen.
objective and
Yes.
goal should
Yeah.
be to do it with integrity,
Sure.
even when they're not there. Could you talk us through sort of why is it so essential that we as teachers include this as any topic of multiculturalism, multi-ethnic experiences? Why is that so important in our classroom as more organic and embedded rather than those one-off situations?
I'll say first, I love that phrasing, like organic and embedded.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was a choice to say, we're centering Black and Brown people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ, historically marginalized people every day. And mostly because you'll learn about Molière with somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have plenty of time to do that elsewhere. But again, going back to that idea of knowing what positions you're going to be in, my students will be in their future. What class am I waiting for them to see that Black people contribute to, culturally, that Black people are people? And I say this in some of the workshops that I've given, I talk a lot about the end game not being self-flagellation, right? Like we don't want to just see that we've been doing it wrong and then feel bad and then whatever. We can sort of look at some actionable things. And one thing that seems pretty clear to me is like if you're only doing this in the month of February, minimally, that's an opportunity to self-reflect, right? What are we saying to Black and Brown students if we're just putting them up for decoration for a season? You know, what are we saying about their true value? And importantly, to the idea of diversity, genuine equity, genuine inclusion, genuine belonging. Are we saying that you belong in this classroom when I only highlight you in February? You know, and highlight you, and I put in quotes, but when I show that people who look like you, people with lived experiences that reflect your own, that they're worthy of study, that their poetry, that their storytelling, that their style of storytelling, that their existence beyond the arrival of Europeans, right? That's worthy of our academic study beyond just a month that I can post on Pinterest. One of the things that I learned through that is that I think a lot of times people fear, people avoid doing that for a few reasons. One of which is that they feel like they need to be experts first. And that hasn't been my experience. There's so much value in embarking on that journey alongside your students, right? Not assuming that I need to know everything first, but modeling that lifelong learning alongside them. So that's number one. Number two is that I think people think that you will then compromise the three major modes of communication if you focus too much on that. And again, that hasn't been my experience. We do so much. Again, this music unit that I'm about to put out that touches in Senegal and that touches in music that comes out of Les Antilles. We talk about I like to listen to music. I used to play this instrument, but now I play this instrument, right?
Mhm.
And those linguistic, purely linguistic things, if I only looked at it through a language proficiency lens, that I don't have to compromise that at all, while I'm also able to center Black and Brown people.
The genuine experience, the idea of you clearly think it's important because you want to do it this month because it's named as the month when you should be looking at
Right?
Black people,
Yeah,
or seeing them in your classroom. But
totally.
the real genuine approach is just embedding it all the time and in all ways, right? This is a very personal question to you as
Yes.
a Black teacher. Do you feel like it's your job and your role to provide this for students? Look, what does that feel like for you?
Mm. Whew. That is a heavy question. And it really touches on, I appreciate that. And thank you for that question. It really touches on a struggle that I'm personally dealing with right now, and that I think a lot of people deal with is that especially in these spaces, in these independent school spaces, you know,
Mhm.
you got to be the magical Negroes, and you feel like the entire weight, the school saying, "Hey, we did it." Like, hey, we got DEI now. Ben Tinsley's here teaching a class, or Ben Tinsley's here, period. So we did it, right? We have a Black male French teacher, nailed it, DEI, done. So not wanting to take on all of that labor that is my school has been around for 260 something years. And is it my job to reverse all of the white supremacy, all of the patriarchy, all of those like oppressive systems? At the same time, can I squander this opportunity? Can I afford to squander this opportunity? Can I, for the sake of my students, for the sake of my conscience, for the sake of my children who attend this school, can I afford to squander this opportunity to start to dismantle some of those symptoms, some of those systems, and start to dismantle some of those approaches that I know affected me growing up, you know, that I know will have a negative ripple effect. So finding a balance where I don't lose sight
Mhm.
of what my own capacity is emotionally, spiritually, but also knowing that I was placed here and that I do have an assignment and that I have what it takes in order to complete that assignment. That's an ongoing struggle for me.
Being put in a position where you feel like you have the experience to speak to it, and sort of what does that look like, and then the responsibility in that. And I think that's important. I mean, I'm a white male, and so I don't have that direct lived experience, of course,
Mhm.
but I constantly need that reminder of what it is like for certain teachers to feel like it is their responsibility, it is
Totally.
their responsibility to do something. So
Yeah.
thank you for taking on that responsibility and recognizing it. We are all so much the better for it. Speaking
Thank
very
you.
personally for myself and seeing the work that you're doing, it has inspired me to just add more to my classroom and recognize my own bias.
Yeah,
I'm going to be open and transparent about this. As a French teacher, I'm Canadian. I tend to focus a lot on the French Canadian experience. I did my university studies in France. I've done the one-off studies about the Francophone cultures in the rest of the world, but what you bring to it in terms of the genuine integrity of
I
it
appreciate that.
is so inspiring to me. Now let's look at your classroom. We sort
Yeah,
of we've talked about theoretically around it. So
sure.
now let's look at the
Yeah.
what it looks like in your classroom and what you're doing with your students. So how do you make sure or assure that your students end up with that full understanding of all of the voices and ethnicities and lived experience of what makes up the Francophone world? What does that look like in your classroom?
A thing that I've realized, and this sort of speaks to your previous question, is that I can't make sure that all of the voices, you know, part of like that's
Hmm.
a Sisyphean task to try to like cover everything, right? So we make choices about what we're
Hmm.
going to include and what we won't, and we sort of have to live with that. I think it also speaks to, again, like that blackness is not myopic, that there are cultural differences between, Abidjan and Yamoussoukro, right? There's cultural differences. Not We can't just say
Hmm.
African music. And so to acknowledge the full range of humanity of Black and Brown people is to acknowledge that, like, there's no way on earth I could cover all of the lived experiences of so many people. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people. So to acknowledge that first, I
Hmm.
think, and then to make choices. So I typically build like thematic units, and I'll do something on I did a unit on religions, for example, and religions as they're represented in our school community. And we always start with like examining home. What do these cultural practices and products look like within our community? And so our kids sent out a survey that was anonymous and optional, and everyone talked about what they identify as in terms of their religious identity. And then we went into Lebanon and we talked about the les Sunnites et les Shiites. Then we went into Benin and talked about the Fon people and the origins of what we know of as voodoo, and how that spread throughout the world. And the kid raises their hand and they're like, "Oh, have you ever seen the movie The Princess and the Frog?" Long story short, the movie takes place in New Orleans, and we start talking about the Creole people in New Orleans and them being the descendants of Haitian refugees, and Haitian people being the descendants of kidnapped Africans from West Africa, places like Benin. And so drawing those connections, right, for them to be able to see the voodoo that they saw in the movie Princess and the Frog, that can tie into what we're studying in this class. And all of that allowed for them to say, I have kids who identify as Sikh in my class, and so their contributions mattered in that setting. For them to say, like, our class dynamic, that percentage point ticked up a little bit when your identity was counted, right? I have kids who identify as
Hmm.
Muslim. I have kids who identify as atheist, as agnostic, right? And that all of those parts of their identities were equally important in terms of our classroom dynamic. And then that we were able to do that cultural analysis and that comparative analysis between what does the makeup look like in our classroom, and then what does it look like in these places that also happen to speak French. And those places that also happen to speak French are exactly that, that their identities aren't tied up in colonization, right? That those people existed long before the arrival and will continue to exist, will continue to matter beyond the arrival of Europeans, all in ways that allowed me
Hmm.
to use high frequency verbs. You know what I'm saying? That allowed me to use like important
Hmm.
structures and not shelter different grammar points or whatever, and really built up their linguistic skills. And now they know that much more about the world. So,
Hmm. I think that's that piece you mentioned earlier, that there's this idea that when you do culture that you're not focusing on the modes and the
exactly.
proficiency, and that's what watching the videos on your website. So if anybody wants to watch their full videos of Ben doing full lessons with his students in his classroom that you can watch. And I saw when you take on some of the
Yeah.
Muslim holidays and you talk through the Muslim holidays in some of the
Mhm.
West African countries that you're looking at. And seeing the way you did it, I sort of think, okay, they do not have to be intermediate, mid to intermediate, high to
Yes,
have this discussion.
that's been another part of my mission too, is that even again on my own, I didn't see that convergence. I didn't see those things happen until way later on, and later on in my journey of language study. And I know that another thing that teachers struggle with is like, can I make this accessible to earlier levels? And so, if we ever touch upon these things, if a kid ever reads a poem by Césaire, it's in AP or in, you know what I mean? Kids who have survived the gauntlet. And so in sixth grade, there's 300 kids who take French, and by the time we get to AP, there's three. And so, like, what about those other 297 kids? Are they ever going to see Black people? Are they ever going to see that Black people matter in this? And again, this isn't limited to the French-speaking world too. So, how can we make those things accessible? And I think we do it again by centering and basing our thematic units and those sorts of things around the cultural practices and products of Black and Brown people. And that requires that we do the work, right? That requires that I mean, half of it is Google searches that keep me up, and then I'm like, oh wow, here's this influencer from DRC, right? Who's like on TikTok right now, and here's this dance challenge that's happening right now. And so, so that requires that we do that sort of work, and it can start with saying Black people in
Mm-hmm.
Bogota, Colombia, right? Like Black culture, Afro-Colombian food, enter, and then just keep reading. When it's presented in class, the thing that I try to keep in mind is that this is just what I've studied, and I don't entirely trust all these sources either. So we approach those sources with a critical lens, also to not say les Berbères, right? And then we find out that all right, Berber might not be the preferred nomenclature for people who identify
Mm-hmm.
as such, and Berber is a group of different, right? So like for us to approach all of those things with a critical lens, for me to have the humility to come back after having taught that lesson to be like, I read another thing and realized that like this terminology actually is a bit antiquated and it's problematic for the following reasons. So just keep that in mind if
Mm-hmm.
when you in your life encounter people who identify as such, or you encounter people who are addressing those sorts of
Mm-hmm.
issues.
So much of what you're talking about in terms of getting to know cultures outside of what has typically been the focus in French classes. If our advocacy work to advocate for the French language and French programs encompassed all of that, I don't think we would be having conversations about losing enrollment,
Absolutely.
and I think that's the direction we need to go in, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
So where are you finding the resources? As you said from Toni Morrison, if you can't find the book, write your own. I'm guessing you're having to do a lot of that. So what does that look like in terms of what you are finding to bring to your classrooms?
One thing, and this I'll count this as a quick plug, is that I started a book club, an Afro-Franco book club that you may have seen me post about.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, the mission of that, the goal of that is as French teachers and as Francophiles, for lack of a better term, in general, is that like we have to build up our own sort of intercultural proficiency. And that can start by reading. That's why we encourage reading at any level,
Mm-hmm.
is because it gives insight into lived experiences, and it gives us rich access to lived experiences. So reading and join the book club, French teachers. It's awesome. Even if you can't make our meetings, which are always amazing, we post discussions on the website and discussion threads. So it's just a really rich way to do that. That said, though, I mean, over the course of 13 years in the classroom, I have put in my 10,000 hours, and I've put in my $10,000 of just buying books, of looking at, I really love folk tales, for example. So I've bought so many books about like collections of African and Antillean folk tales, and just spent time reading those and try to build up my own understanding. Folk tales in particular that give you such a rich insight as to cultural values, right? They tend to be based in some sort of moral message. So you can really get an insight as to what that culture values. That said, though, I realize that teachers are spread super thin, and it's a lot of work. So I'm like, I do this in my classroom. How can I start to share that? How can I start to share the things that I'm doing? And it's for that reason that I've been really trying to like package my materials and such. Because the time that I spent learning about the history of the indigenous people of the island of Hispaniola before the arrival, right? The time that I spent doing that, you might be able to read this map talk script that I have so that your children can name those indigenous peoples, so that your students can name, you know, those sorts of things. So you can find those materials on my website. um,
I'm waiting with bated breath for all of them to come out. So
yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah,
yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Where are you continuing to find your inspiration? This is not easy work. You know, you got to keep
No,
writing the book because you can't find it. But where's your
yeah.
inspiration keep coming from?
I listen to a decent amount of podcasts. One in particular, Kif Terrasse, and the two main co-hostesses of that, Rokhaya Diallo is a French woman of Senegalese descent, and she is an amazing follow on social media, super important person to follow. And she speaks, the podcast itself speaks on issues of race and identity in France. And she is brilliant, and she's a really important person to follow. Also, I think just collaborating with other teachers, I'm really grateful for the fact that in the last, again, I've been teaching 13 years. It's only been the last year that I've started to connect so much with people outside of my own school,
Mm-hmm.
wherever it is that I've been. So continuing to work with other teachers and to have access to what people are doing within their classrooms has been great. And then again, just keep reading. I can't emphasize enough the importance of reading, of even just demonstrating that love of learning, that lifelong learning. I feel like that's like the sub standard for what the last C in the five
Mm-hmm.
C's, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like lifelong learning. So to model that for our kids, I feel like that has made me such a better teacher, is that learn more and trying to read more, and get and build up my own sort of intercultural proficiency
Mm-hmm.
in that sort of way.
So I've seen that you do workshops, schools, conferences, and all that. Where have you been doing that over the last couple of years? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, sure. So I did a few workshops over the summer. One was hosted by actually a former school where I used to teach, and that one was centered in, they do a lot of work in positive psychology and positive education. So we talked a lot about like the importance of fostering a sense of belonging in the classroom. And again, how we can't see these things as isolated, sort of one off, whatever, that socio emotional learning is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is socio emotional learning. And that those things have immediate impacts, or like direct impacts on the other modes of proficiency
Mm-hmm.
and all that. So that was a really cool thing we did. I did a thing with the Kansas World Language Association also. I worked with another recently. I did a workshop with the language department at a local school, one of our peer schools in the Philadelphia area. And I've been doing some one-on-one
Mm-hmm.
coaching and training. And I really feel like I have learned so much from, just like in the classroom, I've learned so much from teaching. You know what I mean? Like I've grown so much in even just trying to figure out how to make my message comprehensible
Mm-hmm.
when I'm working with teachers, when I'm working with teachers of languages other than French.
Mm-hmm.
For me, how can I make this takeaway? How can I measure the success of this takeaway that I intended?
Mm-hmm.
How can I establish this objective?
Right.
So I've been doing a lot of
Mm-hmm.
cool things, and I'm super proud
Nice.
of that.
Well, it's to all of our benefit that you are going beyond the walls of your classroom now and taking your 13 years and 10,000 hours, I think you said, and learning from it. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Right, so
Thank you.
this is the part of the podcast where I say pull the teacher curtain back a little bit and get to know.
Sure.
This is definitely getting to know Benzo a little bit
Yeah.
more with our
Sounds good.
either
Yeah.
or.
Yeah.
All right, so we can learn a little bit more about you. Okay, so
Yeah.
uh, first couple are focused on travel. I have travel on my mind. It's just like something that we are
Yeah,
all can't really be doing too much of right now.
for
So
sure.
when you're packing for a trip, do you
Mm.
pack lightly or do you throw it all in?
I pack lightly. I'm also a husband and a father of three, so I'm packing for 5 people. And there's no such thing as packing lightly. But I'm a light packer. I'll bring, as many as the bare minimum amount of things that I need in order for a successful trip.
You're putting everything in for everyone else, but minimally for yourself.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so continue a little on this travel theme.
Mhm.
You have the opportunity next week to go somewhere. They've just
Mm.
said school's off for the week, and money's no issue. Do you go to a place you've been to and that you love, or you want to explore a new place?
Whew.
Woo!
Yeah. So I think my honest answer is a new place because I had an answer. I thought you were going to ask me what place, and I had an answer, and it's a place I haven't been to. So I think my answer to your question is a new
A
place.
new place. Explore a new
Yeah,
place. Where
yeah.
is that place that you want to go to?
Lagos, Nigeria.
Okay.
We
Okay.
have a lot of friends from there, and we have a lot of Nigerian friends, a lot of friends from Lagos, and they've just been such an important part of our village.
Hmm.
And I've learned so much about it, and I'm just really excited about experiencing it.
Awesome. Okay, now
Yeah.
the next one. I know that you are an incredibly avid reader. I
Mhm.
see this you in your book clubs and everything. So, do you stick to paper books or do you venture into ebooks sometimes?
Ebooks all day. It took me a while to get there, but my Kindle, like I wear my Kindle out. Um, and I have the Libby app, so I'm able to download and then download from the library rather. Borrow books from the library. So I'm an ebook guy. I
Hmm.
used to, going back to the packing for traveling, I used to pack like 3 or 4 or 5 books, and then that weighs 75 pounds.
Hmm.
But being able to throw everything on a Kindle and to have access to it on my phone when I want to do a little bit more reading and stuff, I'm a Kindle guy,
Yeah.
ebook.
Do you listen to books as well, or do you want to read it?
I listen to books as well. So I used to, my time for that used to be during my commute, but now I drive into school with my sons.
Hmm.
And so I'm listening to, Diary of a Wimpy Kid
Yeah.
more so these days. But yeah, I love books in all formats, 100%.
There's so much that we've kind of taken in with all of this. And what's the best way for teachers to be reaching out to you to learn more about you and to get their hands on your 10,000 hours of work, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm on Twitter and Instagram as at AfroFranco2. There's also the Facebook group. If you search AfroFranco, there's a Facebook group where I sort of house the discussions for the book club and post some of my stuff. The website is afrofranco.com,
Hmm.
and that's where the blog is and access to the different workshops that I do, and some things for the book club as well.
So, as we finish up here, there's so much to take in from what we've been
For sure.
discussing. And could you leave us with one like hearty, actionable word of advice when we're trying to bring those underrepresented voices into our language curriculum?
Yeah, I think to model the intellectual curiosity will inherently make you humble enough to acknowledge that like you're not an expert yet and that that's okay and that you can learn alongside your students.
Hmm.
So think about modeling the intellectual curiosity to say, I am excited to learn more about this, and start from a place of curiosity and see where that takes you.
I have very much appreciated spending this time with you and learning from you. And I know that teachers are going to take a lot from this conversation back to their classrooms and their teaching in general. So, a huge thank you for spending your time with us today.
Joshua, I can't thank you enough. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope we get a chance to talk again.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Ben Tinsley?
I'm sure that we're all feeling inspired to provide windows and mirrors so that our students see themselves and also understand the diversity within our target language cultures. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Ben Tinsley. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. Talk to you soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.